Okay, the Gunpowder Plot. That's the famous rhyme. But I don't know how much people actually do remember about the reason of the behind the present day bonfires and fireworks. Having talked to some people, they're a bit vague about it. But it was one of the most widely known historical events in English history, and its imagery is still used today, with Guy Fawkes masks worn by protesters, used in films. His image used by groups to signify opposition to the status quo. And generally, the story is told like this. James VI of Scotland succeeds Elizabeth I to become James I of England. A group of Catholics, unhappy with his and his government's treatment, decide to blow up Parliament on its state opening on November the 5th, 1605, when they knew James would be present. Fortunately, James and his Secretary of State and Chief Spy Master, Robert Cecil, get wind of this through an anonymous letter sent to William Parker, 4th Baron Monteagle, on November the 5th, or some day before November the 5th. Guy Fawkes is discovered in a cellar under Parliament, match in hand, with 36 barrels of gunpowder. He confesses and gives the names of his fellow conspirators, and some of those are killed, evading capture, and the rest are executed. England is saved, and from then on, the day is celebrated by bonfires, fireworks, and the burning of an effigy. In 1606, the observance of 5th of November Act was passed, enforcing an annual public day of thanksgiving for the plot's failure. It became known as Gunpowder Treason Day. In the years that followed, effigies of the Pope were burnt on November the 5th, continuing the anti-Catholic sentiment of the time. Celebrations became more elaborate, with fireworks and mini explosives being let off, and on many occasions the night became very raucous and sometimes violent. Towards the end of the 18th century, children began walking the streets with homemade mask effigies of Guy Fawkes, begging for a penny for the guy. As Catholic emancipation was achieved, Guy Fawkes replaced the Pope atop the burning bonfires, and the day shifted from Gunpowder Treason Day to Guy Fawkes Day. The commemoration has begun to lose its religious and political undertones, and in 1859 the observance of 5th of November Act was repealed. The plotters. There's a picture of some of the plotters, some of the more famous ones. That's a contemporary print of the time. But of course, history is never as simple as it seems. Why did the plotters want to kill James and his ministers? How did they plan to carry it out? Did they have any outside help? How soon and how much did the authorities actually know of the plot? But first, go back into Tudor England. Henry VIII issued the Act of Supremacy in 1534, making him the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, of the Church in England. Essentially, though, the Church remained Catholic in practice and worship. Then along came his son, Edward VI, and he made the Church recognisably Protestant. This was then reversed by his sister, Mary, who also repealed the Act of Supremacy. Then Elizabeth succeeded Mary. A second Act of Supremacy was passed in 1559, along with an Act of Uniformity, which made worship in the Church of England compulsory. Anyone who took office in the English Church or government was required to take the oath of supremacy, and penalties for violating it included hanging and quartering. Attendance at Anglican services became obligatory. Those who refused to attend the services, whether Roman Catholics or, in other cases, extreme Protestants like Puritans, were fined and physically punished as recusants. Elizabeth Church was a compromise between Protestant and Catholic doctrine, but during her reign, a hugely influential book called Fox's Book of Martyrs was published, and that's an illustration from it. This used the persecution of the non-Catholics that had occurred during the reign of Queen Mary to fuel strong anti-Catholic propaganda. In 1571, the Church of England ordered copies of the Book of Martyrs should be kept for public inspection in all cathedrals and in the houses of church dignitaries. The book was also displayed in many Anglican parish churches alongside the Bible. The passionate intensity of its style and vivid and picturesque dialogues made the book very popular among Puritan and some low church families, Anglican and Protestant nonconformists down to the 19th century. English anti-Catholicism was grounded in the fear that the Pope sought to reimpose not just a spiritual authority, but also secular power over England. This was enhanced by various papal bulls and the attempts of invasion by Philip of Spain. The persecution of Catholics continued throughout Elizabeth's reign. There was lots of previous plots before the Gunpowder plot. They've been a feature of English politics for centuries. What they had in common was that they all involved higher gentry and influential landowners and aimed either to pressure the monarch into concessions by targeting the evil councillors or replacing the monarch with a viable alternative who could claim some sort of legitimacy. In the late 16th century came Catholic-supported attempts to remove Elizabeth from the English throne and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. And those are the four main ones: the Ridolfi plot, Throckmorton, Parry and Babington plots. Pope Pius had sanctioned Elizabeth's overthrow in 1570, and all the plots were similar in that they aimed to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. There was to be a general uprising of English Catholics supported by a foreign invasion, either Spanish or French. But all of these plots were discovered beforehand by Elizabeth's intelligence services, led by Sir Francis Walsingham and Lord Burleigh. Lord Burleigh was Robert Cecil's father, who became the chief minister for Elizabeth and James. They were both rabid anti-Catholics and opposed to any lessening of Catholic persecution. While there's no doubt there was discontent amongst England's Catholic population and plots were hatched to try and overthrow Elizabeth and restore the Catholic faith, the doubt lies in how much of these plots were assisted or even initiated by Walsingham and Burleigh. Both Ridolfi and Parry as later were exposed as double agents working for one or the other. The Throckmorton plot and the Babington plot were real, but they were both helped along by Walsingham. Francis Throckmorton was allowed to send messages to the Spanish, and Mary and Thomas Babington were enabled to exchange letters, and all these letters and messages were read by Walsingham. All the plots were discovered by them, and all the evidence came from confessions obtained under torture, and all ended in executions after a very swift show trial. Now we come to Robert Cecil. He rose to prominence in the court of Elizabeth I through being the son of her principal minister, Lord Burleigh, and he was a protege of Francis Walsingham. He was widely disliked, and he was mocked for his appearance. In those days, outward physical appearance often was associated with inward moral degeneration or something. Because he was only 5'4" tall. He suffered from scurvy, had sclerosis, curvature of the back, and was hunchbacked. Cecil became the leading minister after the death of his father in August 1598, and then served both Queen Elizabeth and King James as Secretary of State. Although he was James' principal minister, on whom most of the day-to-day running of the kingdom fell onto, and he was a member of the Privy Council, he was actually not a member of the Privy Chamber, which was like an inner group, or James's bedchamber. That's where people would go and influence the king. There was always complaints that it was crowded with Scotsmen who didn't have the best what we're trying to say here, who stank a bit anyway. He was also excluded from the hunting that James spent a lot of his time pursuing, and that's another way that people could get hold of him and talk him into what they wanted him to do. He had a network of spies and informants across England, especially in London and Westminster. At this time, Westminster was still a small but busy village just outside the walls of London. He was also receiving bribes and an annual pension from the Spanish in the hope that he could persuade James to be more lenient on his Catholic subjects. At the same time, he was very anti-Catholic. So, then we come to the Essex Rebellion of 1601. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was a favourite of the Queen, and he led a rebellion in an attempt to remove the influence of Cecil and his followers in Elizabeth's court. Essex and Cecil were rivals for influence over Elizabeth, and for what they saw in 1601 as the future King James. Both wrote to him on a regular basis. So Essex gathered a band of swordsmen, including certain youthful Catholics, who saw in a rebellion an opening to secure religious toleration. But the rising failed before it began. Meeting with no little or popular support, Cecil ensured that Essex was tried on treason and attempting to murder the Queen, while some of Essex Catholic accomplices, amongst them a certain Lord Monteagle and Robert Catesby, were reprieved. Essex was tried and executed on the 25th of February 1601. So Cecil turned what was a rebellion to remove his influence into ensure that it was an actual act of treason. So King James, he became king in March 1603, but he didn't call his first parliament until a year later to ask for taxes, especially for his plan to unite England and Scotland. At this time, Parliament was only called when the monarch needed funds, and it only met for a matter of weeks or even days. James was very, he spent a lot of money, more than any monarch before him, and he was always in debt. But Parliament refused to grant James anything at all. And the Blessed Parliament, as it became known, was prorogued less than 3 months later. The second session was due to begin in February 1605, but was postponed to October and then again to November. Meanwhile, England had been at war with Spain for quite a few years. English Catholics had hoped that James would ease the burden on them. And as he was committed to ending the war with Spain, it was thought that one of the Spanish conditions would be the legal constraints on Catholic worship being relaxed. So talks began in Somerset House on the Strand on the 20th of May, 1604, between officials from Spain, the Spanish Netherlands and England. including Robert Percy. That's him at the front on the right. Robert Percy, though, besides receiving money from the Spanish, was also being bribed by the Dutch rebels. So he was playing both off one against the other. The Treaty of London was signed in August 1604, and it amounted to an acknowledgement by Spain that its hopes of restoring Roman Catholicism in England were at an end, and it had to recognise a Protestant monarchy in England. In return, England ended its financial and military support for the Dutch rebellion and had to end its wartime disruption of Spanish transatlantic shipping and colonial expansion. And this dashed any hope of a Spanish intervention to help English Catholics. Now we come to the official account of the Gunpowder Plot. The official account of the Gunpowder Plot, published in what's called the King's Book. Also, coincidentally, it's supposed to have begun on 20th of May 1604. At that point, when English Catholics were full of hope that the Spanish agreement would ensure more religious freedom. Plotters met in a tavern called the Duck and Drake, which was also on the Strand. Evidence for this meeting comes only from the confession of Guy Fawkes, and it's said to have involved Robert Catesby, Thomas Winter, John Wright, Guy Fawkes, and Thomas Percy. And Percy was actually a member of the King's bodyguard. The plot was to blow up the King, his family, and the government at the next opening of Parliament, coinciding with a rising in the Midlands, kidnapping the King's daughter Elizabeth, make her queen with the regent, and secure England for Catholicism. According to Fawkes' confession, a room was rented in Westminster, and in December, the conspirators decided to dig a tunnel under Parliament and then blow it up with gunpowder. These gentlemen, with no experience of mining whatsoever, then laboured on the tunnel for the next few months. They brought barrels of gunpowder to store in the room, along with wood to shore up the tunnel. And the earth from the tunnel was deposited in a small garden at the side of the house. They tunnelled until they reached a wall and eventually decided they could not get through because it was 9 feet thick. How they knew the thickness has never been explained. While they were trying to get through, they became aware of a cellar above them. This was not an actual cellar, but a large ground floor vault directly under the House of Lords. How they did not know about this vault beforehand is not explained, as Percy was a member of the royal bodyguard and it was used by the public on a regular basis. He obtained a lease at the end of March 1605 and transferred 36 barrels of gunpowder into the vault, covered it with 3,500 faggots of firewood and placed iron and masonry on the top. It was then left to be ignited whenever Parliament next met. According to the King's Book, the discovery of the plot begins with an anonymous letter sent to Lord Monteagle, the same Lord Monteagle of the Essex Rebellion, warning him not to go to the opening of Parliament. The letter was given to a servant in the street outside a lodge that Monteagle had not visited for over 12 months. Monteagle then summoned another servant to read the letter aloud. No one could decipher what it meant, so Monteagle sent it to Cecil. Cecil summoned other members of the Privy Council, but they too couldn't make it out. It was only when it was shown to the King that he realised that they meant to blow up Parliament. A search was made, but nothing was found. The King ordered the second search, and Fawkes and the gunpowder were discovered. Fawkes was arrested and eventually implicated his fellow conspirators, including Catesby and Thomas Percy. The survivors were arrested. I'm missed a bit there. Yeah, Fawkes was arrested and implicated other members of the plot. They fled London and on hearing about the plot's discovery, and they fled to the Midlands. They were surrounded in a house by some local militia, and in the ensuing fight, 4 of them were killed, and that Catesby and Thomas Percy were killed. The survivors were arrested and tortured until they confessed. The confessions of Fawkes and Thomas Winter were published as part of the King's Book account. There was a short trial, and soon they were executed, except for one of them, Francis Tresham, who had died in the Tower of Natural Causes. So, if we re-examine that Gunpowder plot account, most historians now think that the whole tunnelling malarkey did not happen, as a tunnel was never discovered, and the whole story seems very unlikely. Westminster was a busy place, bustling with workmen and residents, and many of Cecil's informers, yet nobody noticed 7 gentlemen squeeze into a small room, bringing in barrels of gunpowder and wood, and then tunnelling, none of them having any previous experience of digging a mine, not to mention the piles of earth that must have come out of the tunnel. No one heard a thing, although the tunnellers did hear coal being moved in the vault above. As for the anonymous letter, it seems strange that whoever delivered it knew exactly where Monteagle would be that evening. To then get a servant to read it out loud is also strange. And finally, Cecil and the Privy Councillors were then unable to make head and tail of it until they showed it to the king, who interpreted it straight away. Monteagle, as I said, had been involved in the Essex Rebellion, but had been spared by Robert Cecil and was actually in Cecil's debt. And after the end of the plot, he was handsomely rewarded. And at that time, all gunpowder was carefully controlled by the government and had to be kept in the Tower of London. Records of 1605 mysteriously disappeared. Gunpowder at that time was also very unstable, and there was a high risk of accidental ignition. It was also prone to decay through damp and deterioration of the mixture. Moving it was hazardous, and yet they managed to move it to a house and then into a vault, and then they left it unguarded for several months while access to the vault was public. And once the gunpowder was discovered, there's no record of it, and nobody ever saw it again. Monteagle actually received the anonymous letter on the 27th of October, but nothing was done until the 4th of November. Cecil gave several different accounts of what happened after getting the letter in his correspondence to various ambassadors. The final official version gives credit to King James as the only one who had the intellect to know what it meant. Now we come to the confessions. Apparently all the plotters confessed, but the only 2 confessions that were actually published was of Guy Fawkes, and Thomas Winter. Both were extracted under torture. It shows more what Cecil wanted to say than anything else. Fawkes could barely write his name on his final confession. You can see there is the first signature on his first confession. His last confession, he can barely write. Winter had been badly injured and his right arm useless. but he supposedly managed to write out his confession and sign it. His signature, however, looks different to the rest of the document, and his name is spelt wrong. His name's it's spelt Winter, W-I-N-T-A-R, whereas in every other document he signed before this time, he signed it Winter, which is W-I-N-T-O-U-R. So outside the official government account and the published confessions, there are actually no independent accounts of what happened at Westminster. No statements from the men who discovered Fawkes and the gunpowder. No record of the gunpowder after the 5th of November. And no one was shown where the vault where the gunpowder was supposed to have been kept. And at the time, with the opening of Parliament, there was many foreign ambassadors in Westminster. Then we come to the rising in the Midlands. Now, there is evidence outside the King Book and the confessions that there was a plan to attempt a rising in the Midlands. Cecil had instructed the local militia in the Warwickshire area not to stand down and be issued with new weapons and armour. He also wrote letters saying that some scheme was being hatched in the Midlands. So it seems that through his network of agents, he had got wind of something going on as early as the summer of 1605. Indeed, Thomas Winter had been gathering horses since 1601 in the hope of some rising, and had continued to do so on the pretext of joining the English Legion in the Spanish army. Everard Digby was a wealthy landowner and a member of the King's bodyguard. From this area, and he secretly converted to Catholicism. And he had procured 50 horses for a use in any rising. Digby had been brought into the plot by Robert Catesby. Then the capture of the plotters. The story of Catesby and company fleeing London and riding to Staffordshire is highly unlikely, given it would be a journey of around 4 days in the 17th century. Yet they seem to have done it in just over a day. There is also a note from one of Cecil's agents, George Southwark, on the 27th of October, that he is on the tail of certain Catholic priests involved in a plot. On the 5th of November, he writes that he is ready to arrest the plotters. Another agent wrote on the 3rd of November saying he had found a hideout and he could detain hatchers and plotters of this damnable stratagem. On the 6th of November, a list was published of those suspected of organising a rising. All the plotters were on the list, but Fawkes supposedly only named them on the 7th. The alleged shootout and the drying of the gunpowder by the fire could also be a fiction. The suspicion then and now and since is that the plotters had actually surrendered, but on Cecil's orders, certain ones were killed. And we have Francis Tresham and Edward Digby. This is Francis Tresham, the one who died in the Tower. He was brought into his plot by his cousin Robert Catesby. He had come into his inheritance and so was very wealthy. He was the only plotter not to flee London on the news of Fawkes' arrest. He was the only plotter to be allowed visitors when he was imprisoned. His family were allowed to keep, he was visited by all his family, his wife, his children, and acquaintances. His family were allowed to keep his lands and property after his death. That didn't happen for any of the other plotters. Some believe that Tresham actually slipped away from the Tower before the date of his supposed death. His servant said that a confession he wrote on his deathbed was kept back for over 3 weeks, meaning that Tresham could have left the Tower before the end of November. At the trial of the conspirators, Everard Digby was the only one who pleaded guilty to treason. but he only admitted gathering the horses for a rising, and according to him, knew nothing of any plans to blow up Parliament. He was open as well that to plead guilty he would be beheaded, which he wasn't. He was hung, drawn and quartered like the rest of them. So, the aftermath. When Parliament resumed after the Gunpowder plot, it was told, the gathering MPs and Lords were told they owed their lives to the King and Cecil. It then voted through a huge sum of money for the King after being so reluctant to do so on previous occasions. Even harsher laws against Catholics were then passed. The Popish Recusants Act of 1605 forbade Roman Catholics from practicing the professions of law and medicine and from acting as a guardian or trustee. It allowed magistrates to search the house for arms and more besides. Cecil also took the opportunity to try and settle some old scores with his rivals, with mixed success. Lord Monteagle, as I said before, was given a large reward and an annual pension. November the 5th became a public holiday by Act of Parliament and was known as Gunpowder Treason Day. And sometimes he was even referred to as Thanksgiving Day. As I said, this wasn't repealed to the 19th century. So, we have competing theories. One, the whole plot was described as described in the King's book. Now, not many people believe this. As I said, the second bit, the mine was fiction, but the rest is true. That is more believable. But the question is, why was the mine story invented? It was never, like I said, it was never found. And when the Houses of Parliament were rebuilt, when they dug down the excavations, there was nothing found. Then the next theory, Cecil only found out about the plot with Monteagle's letter, and then either did nothing to let the plot ripen, as he said, or did nothing until he could have let King James work it out, and so suck up to King James, saying he's the cleverest of all. Next theory, Cecil knew about the Midlands rising, but not about the gunpowder until he received the letter. The next one, Cecil knew about the plot in the summer of 1605, but deliberately enabled it. He actually let it carry on so it would get to a conclusion where he could be seen to be saving everybody. Cecil knew about the plot, but invented the tunnelling in gunpowder to make the plot more shocking. So in this theory, there was actually no gunpowder under the House of Commons. And finally, Cecil instigated the whole thing either by using Monteagle or Catesby's stooges, and one of the plotters, possibly Tresham, was a double agent. So that's all the theories that there is, really. A lot of historians seem to think that Cecil did know about the plot. The mine was definitely a fiction, and then from how much he knew and how much he actually enabled it, that's where the dispute comes on. So that's how the gunpowder plot played out in 1605. And then back in my day, in 1950s and 60s, that's what we used to do every November. That and go logging for wood. That's it. Thank you.